Systematic Theology Volume I. The Triune God. Robert W. Jenson, New York, Oxford University Press, 1997. Genetrici Theologiae Mea Omni Blanche Amatissimi. Preface. Publishing a system of theology is an irremediably hubristic enterprise. I can only say that it nevertheless seemed and seems like something I should do, and that the one person whose judgment I trust in such matters is more certain than I can be. The following is offered for whatever use the Church can make of it, and beyond that for whatever use God will make of it in the discourse of the kingdom. 2. Theology is the Church's enterprise of thought, and the only Church conceivably in question is the unique and unitary Church of the creeds. Therefore theology may be impossible in the situation of a divided Church, its proper agent not being extant, unless, of course, one is willing to say that a particular confessional or jurisdictional body simply is the one Church. To live as the Church in the situation of a divided Church, if this can happen at all, must at least mean that we confess we live in radical self-contradiction, and that by every churchly act, we contradict that contradiction. Also theology must make this double contradiction at and by every step of its way. We commonly speak of such things as Roman Catholic, or Baptist, or Lutheran theology. Such labels can be used in a harmless historically descriptive sense, as one can say that Orthodox theology tends to a Cyrilline Christology. They may be used in a somewhat more ominous descriptive sense, as someone might say that Reformed theology cannot accept certain ways of asserting papal primacy. But a theologian who described her or his own work as Lutheran, or Reformed, or whatever such, and meant by that label to identify the Church the work was to serve, would either deny the name of Church to all but his or her own allegiance or desecrate the theological enterprise. It is sharpened recognition of such stark alternatives that has driven a characteristic form of modern ecumenism, the search for healing of churchly divisions by theological convergence. The dialogues and the convergence theology they practice have achieved marvels. But it is becoming clear that re-establishment of ecclesial fellowship between East and West and within the West across the divisions begun at the Reformation will not occur by any straightforward continuation of these efforts. It increasingly appears that no degree of theological convergence can by itself suffice to re-establish communion once broken. An act of God is needed. Nor need this be a pessimistic prediction. The Church must regard waiting as the most creative of activities, since she apprehends fullness of being only in the coming kingdom. And God may act tomorrow. In the meantime, it is a great blessing specifically to theology that we need not wait for the Church to be undivided to do theology for, and even of the undivided Church. For theology is itself a form of the waiting we must practice. The present work is deliberately done in such anticipation of the one Church, and this will be throughout apparent, in its use of authorities and its modes of argument. Yet no one can escape being bent and limited by the division of the Church and by his or her particular location in the landscape created by the divisions. The author of a work of systematic theology therefore owes readers a statement of confessional limitations. The system here presented is a Western system, and cannot escape identification as such. Nevertheless, some of its key positions are reinventions of orthodox wheels. Orthodox readers may therefore wonder why these positions are enveloped in long arguments. Why not just start with the truth of the holy tradition, since it is available? But the Western Church has gone through history the Eastern Church has so far missed, and this is reflected in problems that a Western theologian must work through. Nor are such necessities always bad. Much has been perceived in the West's conceptually tortured theological history that orthodoxy also now needs to reckon with. The Western Church in turn divided at the time of the Reformation, and Protestantism has since been notoriously vociferous. The ecumenical dialogues have, however, revealed only one functioning line of continuing division between parties of the Western Church. It runs between Catholic and Protestant, that is, between the Roman Catholic Church, together with any Protestants who may on a given question side with her, and what is on that question the remainder of the Protestants. Insofar as I oversee the questions that now occasion such division, I more often espouse the Catholic side. At the same time, I regard the initial program of the Reformation as mandated, and Protestantism has, in any case, produced a remarkable line of theologians, on some of whom I will depend throughout the work. And here it must further be noted that where typically Lutheran and Reformed positions diverge, I am more likely to draw from the Lutheran side. Success at doing theology for the one church will in any case be at best partial. If the following is read at all, it will be read in some churchly quarters more than in others, although the distribution may not be determined by confessional labels. Errors and weaknesses not apparent to me will be instantly apparent to some located differently on the ecumenical map. There are a quite sufficient number of weaknesses that are apparent to me, and some of these are also caused not by sloth or incapacity, although many of course doubtless are, but by limitations of appreciation inevitable within a divided church. Every theological effort is involved in the church's conversation with some surrounding religious culture, and so also this one. Recent clamor for contextual theology is of course empty, there never having been any other kind. A chief mark of the religious culture of Western modernity is historical self-consciousness. Thus theological proposals in the modern West typically not only converse with a particular religious and intellectual situation, but describe their interlocutor. If such description pervades a theological effort, we may classify the work as apologetic theology. The present work is not thematically apologetic and will not often explicitly refer to our cultural situation. Nevertheless, I owe readers some statement of how I diagnose the cultural religious world in which the Western Church, and churches significantly determined by converse with the West, now find themselves. Very early in my theological reflection I was struck with the secularizing impact of the gospel. In my then more specific vocation as a theologian of culture, this prompted reflection about the fate of a culture that has long heard the gospel and been determined thereby in its institutions and hopes, and has then ceased to believe. Nietzsche's prophecy seemed veridical: nihilism must be the fate of a once but no longer culturally Christian West. The gospel is a two-edged sword. The latter-day history of Western culture demonstrates its backslash. Whether nihilism can itself become historically actual or can only appear as the threat of its own appearing remains to be seen. The proclaimed nihilism of our academic and publicistic elites has, anyway, an already elderly tone. What for Nietzsche was prophecy has become for his epigones curriculum and rules of correct behavior. Nevertheless, in the West it is for the foreseeable future the threat of nihilism that determines the cultural religion and theology that the gospel must interpret. Current vocabulary refers to the period under this threat as postmodern. It will not after these paragraphs often be made explicit, but readers should bear it in mind. Both the innovations and the emphasized conservations of the following system respond to questions posed to the Church in a world religiously determined by the awaited advent of nothingness. For there is no standard plan of systematic or dogmatic theology. Variation is partly caused by differences between the religious and intellectual contexts the gospel has inhabited through its history. It is partly caused by actual theological disagreement, which often includes differing intimations of the faith's intrinsic logic. It is partly caused merely by differing judgments of how such things as simplicity and demonstrative power are best achieved. In this respect, there is truth in the maxim that method is arbitrary. And it is at present partly caused by the divisions of the Church. Within the Western tradition, two plans have been typical, one within Catholicism and the other within Protestantism. If we think of God as himself the subject matter of theology, as did scholastic and tridentine theology, then the matters to be discussed will be God himself on the one hand and on the other hand everything else, as other things are ordered to God as to their source and final goal. Thomas Aquinas, Summa Theologiae. Point 1.8. Since everything but God must thus be interpreted by reference to him, the interpretation of God must come first. This yields a starkly simple basic outline, which is insofar imitated by the present work: first God, then his creations. Protestant theology in its 17th century maturity adopted the analytic method as appropriate to a practical discipline, that is, to a discipline that is primarily a guide to some practice, in this case true faith in God. According to this method, the goal of a practice, as it defines the practice, is discussed first, then the subject of the practice, then the means. Here the goal is God, as the object of faith, the subject is humanity, and the means are Christ, the Church, the sacraments, and the like. This yields an order that does not at first sight obtrusively differ from the scholastic order, but which nevertheless marches to a very different principle. I have adopted a plan that diverges from both the Catholic and Protestant standard outlines. The basic scholastic division is taken up, but Christology and pneumatology, together with discussions of the historical Jesus, of the doctrine of atonement, and of the resurrection, are drawn back into the doctrine of God, swelling that doctrine to make half the total work. The systematic reasons for this drastic rearrangement will become apparent as we go. Here I note only what will not often later become explicit. The implicit ecumenical agenda, also the plan of the work, is an attempt to transcend confessional habits. Unless a cited document is identified as a translation, all translations are mine. Biblical citations are from the New Revised Standard Version, unless plainly retranslated by me for a special purpose. North Phi J.D., Minnesota R.W.J. Part 1, Prolegomena. 1. What systematic theology is about. The introductory chapters of this work are less ambitious than may be expected. In the modern period, it has often been supposed that the Prolegomena to theology must enable the enterprise, that the axioms and warrants needed to set specifically theological cognition in motion must be antecedently established. For reasons shortly to be stated, this effort must be judged mistaken. The Prolegomena of the present work have therefore a more modest aim. The most Prolegomena to theology can appropriately do is provide readers an advanced description of the enterprise. Even this cannot be a pre-theological beginning, for every attempt to say what sort of thing theology is implies material theological propositions, and so is false if the latter are false. A variety of pursuits have from time to time been called theology, usually in benign or malicious imitation of churchly usage. The Church, like every self-aware community, maintains a continuing discourse about her individuating and carrying communal purpose. What will in this book be called theology, if no other specification is provided, consists of all and only contributions to that enterprise. This does not mean that other religions do not maintain intellectual enterprises that those influenced by the Church's language will probably call theology, although the religions themselves may not. When one of these is hereafter mentioned, the use will be explicit. Nor does it mean that Christian theology should be conducted without reference to such theologies. Indeed, the following work does more of this than is common. Nor yet does it mean that Christian theology, once in process, is not part of the general human cognitive effort or can thrive without acknowledging and cultivating its place therein. It only means that theology has its own task and is enabled within it. We will begin by describing theology simply as such, leaving the distinctions between systematic theology and other subdisciplines until the end of the chapter. Clearly, the next step must be to identify this community, the Church, whose thinking theology is, and to identify her by the purpose in service of which she needs to think. But ecclesiology, the doctrine about the Church, is itself regularly controverted, thus it appears how quickly prolegomenal description of theology sets us within theology itself. The following several paragraphs are therefore to some extent theologically arguable. Yet any who utterly reject them must mean by theology a different cognitive practice than that to which this book hopes to contribute. The purpose that constitutes and distinguishes the Church and in service of which the Church needs to think is maintenance of a particular message, called the Gospel. It happened during the reign of Tiberius at Rome that certain Jews believed themselves to have encountered the prophet and rabbi they had followed, Jesus of Nazareth, alive after his execution, endured somehow for their sake, and to have encountered him so situated over against his own death as to preclude his dying again. 1. Given Israel's grasp of death and life, they could report such events only by saying, "The God of Israel has raised his servant Jesus from the dead." And given Israel's interpretation of God and the meaning that raised must have within her linguistic world, such a risen one must merely thereby be established as somehow Lord of all. 2. The creeds direct progression from rose to is seated at the right hand of God to will judge the living and the dead traces a straightforward conceptual nexus. The news of which these persons found themselves possessed had therefore universal import, and some, indeed, heard in their encounters with the risen one a direct command to tell all of the event. These, with other witnesses, obediently traversed their world telling what they believed had happened among them. They thus came to be called apostles, 3 those sent out. It is the message thereby initiated to which the Church refers as the gospel. Some who heard the first evangelists believed them, and in turn found themselves under obligation to carry the message. And some who heard such subsequent evangelists believed them, and so on. It is the historically continuous community, which in this way began and pursues, that her own linguistic custom calls the Church. Church and gospel therefore mutually determine each other. Whether we are to say that God uses the gospel to gather the Church for himself, or that God provides the Church to carry the gospel to the world, depends entirely on the direction of thought in a context. The Gospel's community has of course no way to copyright her labels for herself or her message. If other communities for some reason wish to appropriate them, we must only be clear what church and gospel denote as here used. There may even have been or be religious movements that have resulted from the historical fact of Jesus, but that are not communities of witness to his resurrection. 5. And which someone might wish to call church or whose teaching someone might wish to call gospel. Here, too, we need only be clear that none such is the community whose thinking is here to be served. 6. A second characterization of theology can now be that theology is the thinking internal to the task of speaking the gospel, whether to humankind as message or to God in praise and petition, for of course the Church speaks the gospel also to God, pleading it before him and praising him for it. The Church's specific enterprise of thought is devoted to the question, how shall we get it across, in language, with signs other than linguistic, in the Church called sacrament and sacrifice, or by other behavior of our community, that Jesus is risen and what that means? It may of course be doubted that any such entity now exists as that here called the Church. 7. Or that the particular line of Church history persists that has demanded theology of the highly reflected sort the present work exemplifies. If books such as this continue to be written, it is in faith that the gates of hell will indeed not prevail against the Church, and in the additional hope that God may find something worth saving also from the rack of Christendom. 2. The more heroic prolegomenal projects of the modern period were not undertaken for frivolous reasons or without a certain historical inevitability. Nevertheless, they have been mistaken. The chief pioneer of this judgment was Karl Barth Tate, but others concur who are otherwise scarcely his followers. 9. Theological prolegomena of an epistemologically pretentious sort are a distinctively modern phenomenon. The knowledge of God attributed to nature by classic pre-modern Western systems occupied a location in some ways similar, but did not function systematically to enable the rest of theology. Thus, to instance the classic Western theologian 10 the entire body of Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, encompassing alike the propositions supposed to be available by nature to all humans and those attributed to historically specific revelation alone, is shaped as a narrative of creational incarnational procession from and return to God. That is, all its propositions have their place within the biblical story of God and his works. And while Thomas indeed says that the axioms of theology are theorems of a prior body of knowledge, this turns out to be knowledge that only God and his perfected saints possess. 11 To which we therefore can appeal only within the mystery of the Church's anticipatory participation in the kingdom. These relations are exactly reflected in the subtle logic of Thomas's proofs of God's reality, with which he gets both some may underweigh. 12 In themselves as arguments, these are conducted without reference to the Church's specific message. But the conclusion of each is the reality of an anonymous metaphysical entity, for example, a certain primary mover. That thereby the reality of God has been proven is each time established by the further observation, and all understand this to be God. But who are these all? They are, of course, those whom Thomas expected might read his writings, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, who all worship the biblical God. A Buddhist, except in tantric apotropaic horror, would precisely not worship a primary mover. Thomas's launching analyses occur within a specifically biblical apprehension already in place. Nevertheless, the seeds of later trouble are present in classic theology. The knowledge encompassed in it was thought to be a body of knowledge about God and his intentions not intrinsically dependent on historically particular divine dispositions, and therefore properly the common property of humanity. In fact, however, this body of theology was as historically particular as any other set of theological proposals. It comprised a part of the theology that Greek religious thinkers, pondering the revelations claimed for Homer and Parmenides, had provided for the cults of Mediterranean antiquity as it became religiously homogeneous, the part that the Church's fathers also found themselves able to affirm. Within high medieval and later theology, the description of the shared truths as unnatural was an explanation of how such overlap was possible. There was proposed to be a knowledge of God and his works available to human reason by virtue of what makes it human and reason, and without an intrinsic need for help from particular divine dispositions. But even if such knowledge occurs, there is no reason to suppose it covers exactly the area in which the fathers found they could agree with Platonic or Stoic or Aristotelian theology. Moreover, the interpretation of such knowledge as that appropriate to humanity's nature can become a covert recommendation of this knowledge, and precisely in its distinction from that given by the gospel. Thus it is not fundamentally the content or source of the theology labeled natural that has made its role in the discourse of Christian theology problematic, but, perhaps we may say, the label itself, that is, the very notion of distinguishing the natural from revealed, or positive theology, as if these lay on different levels. 13 The problems emerged from dormancy in the 17th and 18th centuries. The event makes the break between pre-modern and modern theology. Amid mutual condemnation between established churches, each claiming the true version of the faith, and their invocation by the warring forces of burgeoning nationalism, 17th-century Europe lost trust in the way in which the culture had previously established Christian teaching's plausibility. Catholicism met this challenge by building intellectual walls around the Church, thus temporarily dropping out of the story we are here tracing. Protestantism first met it by making the doctrine of scriptural authority into an antecedent basis for theology's claims. Thus traditional natural arguments for the reliability of Scripture came to bear a new load. We may, it was said, believe Christian doctrine because it is drawn from the Bible, whose truth can be made antecedently plausible. 17th-century Protestant systems' doctrine of Scripture thus already carried the modern prolegomenal burden. The more decisive break, however, occurred in the 18th century. The European North American Enlightenment applied a hermeneutic of suspicion to all received wisdom, particularly that propounded by established authorities. Needing a criterion by which to scrutinize the established church's teaching from Revelation, the Lockeans of the English-speaking world and the Neologians out of Germany thought to find it in that other theology which Christian theology itself had acknowledged. If there is a knowledge of God natural to our being, this knowledge can be the norm of other purported theology. What in fact happened therewith was that the West's Mediterranean pagan religious heritage, truly no more anchored in universal humanity than any other, was elevated to be judge of its biblical heritage. 14 It took only a few decades for this misstep to evacuate elite theology of its specifically Christian content and, indeed, to repristinate, although often in sadly enfeebled form, the theology of pagan Mediterranean antiquity. 15 When 19th-century German thinker 16 then undertook to restore Christian theology by overcoming the Enlightenment, they supposed they should fight on the field laid out by the Enlighteners. The Neo-Protestantism they thereby created, and exported to the rest of Europe and America, supposed it had to find a functional replacement for the old natural theology. And it accepted the usual supposition of the Enlightenment that the Church's specific theology was a problematic enterprise dependent on prior justification by more surely founded cognition, thus the replacement was more heavily burdened than the old natural theology had been. Therewith the fully modern prolegomenal effort began. The archetype of Neo-Protestant prolegomena was provided in 1830 by the first chapter of Friedrich Schleiermacher's Der Christliche Glaube together with other of his writings it invokes. Schleiermacher argued that humanity is intrinsically religious, that is, dependent for authenticity on experience of the eternal, that Christian faith is a particular, in his argued judgment, supreme mode of such experience, that the first-level discourse of Christian faith is meaningful and true as it expresses Christian religious experience, that this expression requires critical explication for its purity, and that once all this is established, theology can proceed in intellectual respectability as the work of such explication. Few subsequent theologians reproduced Schleiermacher's particular argument, nearly all followed its general strategy. Prolegomena have since grown ever longer and more unwieldy, as ever more desperate means are proposed to evade the logic of the situation. The project is hypertropic because it is hopeless. If theological prolegomena lay down conceptual conditions of Christian teaching that are not themselves Christian teaching, that are more than a formal demand for coherence and argumentative responsibility, and that in the Western world are therefore theologumena of Mediterranean paganism, the prolegomena sooner or later turn against the legomena. 17. This is not to say that Neo-Protestantism did not achieve splendid things. For a systematically central instance, Schleiermacher's pioneering analysis of religion is vital for many, including the present writer, who do not use it foundationally as Schleiermacher did. It is only to say that 19th-century response to the Enlightenment harbored a particular flaw. Nor should the foregoing strictures be read as rejection of Western Christianity's inheritance from pagan antiquity. Conversation with the antecedent theology of each encountered religious culture is intrinsic to the Gospel's mission, and this conversation is never merely polemic. That the Fathers were able to agree with the Greeks, 18 as they regularly called their counterparts, that, for example, God has a logos, or that the debate about God's being should be pursued, was constitutive in the missionary history that leads to Western forms of Christianity, and contributes irreplaceably, at least for the West, to the churches. Knowledge of the Gospel. What must not continue is only the Enlightenment's elevation of the Greek element of our thinking to be unilateral judge of the whole, or a practice of theological prolegomena that consciously or unconsciously accepts that elevation. Nor may we continue the mistake that suggested these moves, the qualification of truth taught by Plato or Aristotle as more natural or rational than truth taught by Isaiah or Paul. There is a particular version of these errors that must be noted. We usually refer to the work of Greece's theologians with their own name for it, philosophy. We have thereupon been led to think this must be a different kind of intellectual activity than theology, to which theology perhaps may appeal for foundational 19 purposes or against which theology must perhaps defend itself. But this is a historical illusion. Greek philosophy was simply the theology of the historically particular Olympian Parmenidean religion, later shared with the wider Mediterranean cultic world. The Church Fathers, in direct contact with the Greeks, were usually clear about this. In the view of most of them, the doctrines of the philosophers were simply the theologumena of a different faith, with some of which it might be possible to agree, some of which had to be rejected, and some of which offered occasion of further discussion. Thus Clement of Alexandria, in his exhortation to the Greeks, after chapters of invective against the Greek-taught pagans for their worship of God's works instead of God, continues, I long for God, not the works of God. Now, whom from among you can I take for a co-worker in this longing? For we do not altogether despair of you. Perhaps Plato, 20. There follows a famous passage from Plato about the unknowability of God, and a calm discussion of the issue Plato raises. The secular mood by which some forms of philosophy contrast with Christian theology and that tempts us to take them for a different kind of thinking is simply a character of Olympian religion itself. 21. Which pursued a divinity purged of mystery. Insofar as Western philosophy is not now reduced to the pure study of logic. 22. It is still in fact theology, Christian or Olympian Parmenidean. Theologians of Western Christianity must indeed converse with the philosophers, but only because and insofar as both are engaged in the same sort of enterprise. Neither can we reject the Enlightenment as such. The Enlightenment consisted largely in or before science's 17th century achievement, and that all was earned. The new science's achievements were metaphysically significant in ways from which theology should less have suffered and more have profited than it did, nor can the methodological lessons the Enlightenment drew from new science be dismissed. The only point here made is that the standard Enlightenment erred in its strategy over against theology as it knew it, and that we must reckon with this, among other ways, by eschewing systematically pompous prolegomena. The Church has a mission, to see to the speaking of the gospel, whether to the world as message of salvation or to God as appeal and praise. Theology is the reflection internal to the Church's labor on this assignment. We are thus led to a standard prolegomenal question of classic Western theology, about theologies' speculative and practical characters. In this terminology, a practical discipline is a guide to some practice. A speculative discipline is a cognitive enterprise so captivated by a determinate object that it is its own reward. 24 Medieval theology tended to say that theology is a more speculative than practical discipline. 25 Reformation theology the reverse. 26 Identification of theology as thinking about how to speak the gospel, that is, to do something, supports the Reformation answer as the first to be given. Yet we will see that the older answer is equally necessary. Any practical reflection will be in some degree a critical and self-critical activity, for there is always the possibility that the practice in question is being inappropriately pursued. Thus theology as a practical discipline must always examine the Church's verbal and other practice, and its own guidance of that practice, with the question, does this teaching or other practice further or hinder the saying of the gospel? No community cares greatly for self-critique, nor does the Church. The Reformers were theologians who in a particular moment of the Church's history thought self-critique overdue in certain domains and set out to renew it, with unanticipated church political results. The Reformers' emphasis on the practical role of theology was correlate to their demand for churchly self-critique. Insofar, however, as Protestant theology has since often tended to forget its original position that theology is at least also speculative, the result has been conversely disastrous. Protestant theology has regularly slipped away from captivity to any determinate object. What is first given to theology is the gospel itself as a communication occurring in fact in human history. The gospel, however, is an intrinsically endangered object of thought in that it is itself a discourse. It does not occur without a speaker, and theologians, who take the gospel for the object of their reflection, are normally among the speakers by whom the gospel comes to pass. Theologians are therefore vocationally tempted to take as the object of their reflection, as the gospel, whatever religious propositions they find themselves being in fact moved to utter. A major and generally conservative 19th century systematic theologian stated the position with all desirable clarity: I, the Christian, am the object of knowledge for me. The theologian 27 One way in which theology falls to this temptation is by not noticing it, by proceeding as if theologians occupied some third-person vantage from which to view and describe the affair between God and his people. But equally disastrous is the oppositely besetting sin of Protestant, and much post-Vatican II Catholic, theology that escapes control by any determinate object and makes the gospel be whatever is justifying, or healing, or liberating, or whatever such value the theologian finds her, or himself affirming. 28 Our reflective situation over against the gospel as our object can be subtle rather than merely treacherous only if we persevere in attending to one character of the gospel, that it is witness to something. For however odd a historical event the resurrection may have been, either it happened or it did not, and, if it did, occurred as it did and not otherwise. As witness to the resurrection, the gospel is a determinate object of thought. Moreover, if we remember what the word resurrection must mean in the linguistic context where it comes to mean anything at all, Israel's Bible 29, we will understand that to attend to a putative resurrection must be to attend to a certain putative God. In Israel's scripture, life and death are in the Lord's hands exclusively. If a death and resurrection, that is, a new ordering of life and death, is the given of theology, just so must be this God. Israel's scripture materially concludes with the question posed to Ezekiel, son of a human, what do you think? Can these bones live? These bones that are the whole of my people? Can the death of my people be reversed? 30 Perhaps there has yet been no answer to the question. Christians are those who believe Jesus' resurrection was the Lord's answer to his own question. If this conviction is true, then Israel's God and the Father to whom this man committed his life and from whom he received it again are forever identified. To attend to the resurrection is to attend to God. Self-identified as the one who raised the Lord Jesus, 31 Whoever, and, indeed, whatever, did that, the Church says, is the reality we mean by God. To attend to the resurrection and to attend to this particular putative God, to take either as the object of our reflection, are the same. For we have with these last propositions moved far into the theological circle, using as warrants Theologoumena themselves as yet unfounded. Nor can we be finished with this hasty procedure. Can the Gospel's God really thus be an object for us, that is, something we see and hear and can intend? He can be if the voice of the Gospel, which witnesses to the resurrection and which we do in fact hear, is God's own voice, and if the objects to which this voice calls us to attend, the loaf and cup, the bath, and the rest of the Gospel's factual churchly embodiment, are His own objectivity. That is, the Gospel's God can be an object for us if and only if God is so identified by the risen Jesus and His community as to be identified with them. What we have rushed into is thus the doctrine of Trinity, and our haste but reproduces that which took the Church to this doctrine as her first. Deliberately defined dogma. The present, here much unclarified, point, to attend theologically to the resurrection of Jesus is to attend to the Triune God. To attend to the Gospel in its character as witness to a determinate reality is to worship in Trinitarian specificity, in petition and praise to the Father with the Son in the Spirit. It is by failure intentionally to cast its theology in the space determined by these coordinates that much Protestant theology slips its object. There is an ancient Catholic rule, lex orandi lex credendi, the law of praying is the law of believing. According to this principle, there are distinguishing regularities in the Church's communal life of prayer, and these must govern the Church's formulation of her belief. Chief among such patterns of the Church's prayer is its triune structure, and chief among historical instances of obedience to the Catholic rule is the 3rd and 4th century development of a conceptually elaborated doctrine of Trinity. The Reformation in effect proposed an analogous rule. The Reformation understood theology as critical reflection interior to the Church's mission of proclamation. Thus the Reformation's claim can be summarized by a parody of the Catholic formula, lex proclamandi lex credendi, the law of proclaiming is the law of believing. Theology is to take for its rule the specific character by which the Gospel is the Gospel and not some other sort of discourse. Theology must be thinking that guards the proclamation in this authenticity. The Reformation's doctrine of justification was an attempt to state the particular character of gospel discourse, to state its lex. At least since the Council of Orange, it has not in the Western Church been controversial that God's gifts are gratis, given only because God freely chooses to give them. 32 Reformation theology merely pointed to one relatively neglected aspect of the agreed situation, since God's gifts are given in and through the person Jesus, the giving itself must be a personal act. Which is to say that God's grace occurs as word, as the address by which one person communicates him or herself to others. Thus God's gifts are, said the Reformation, intrinsically bespoken to us, as the Church speaks the word of Christ. Therefore, if those gifts are to be gratis, this speaking must itself be gratuitous in its linguistic character. The kind of speaking that bestows something gratis can be specified, it is promising that does so. Thus the decisive maxim of all the Reformation's theology, God's gifts are residential promisor, the stuff of promise. 33 Surely both formulas are needed. When the Reformation's rule from proclamation is not followed, theology slips from its assignment. When the Catholic rule from prayer is not followed, theology slips from its object, for it is in the Church's prayer and praise, in their verbal form and in the obtrusively embodied forms called sacrifice, that the Church's discourse turns and fastens itself to God as its object. And it is the ineluctably Trinitarian pattern of the Church's prayer, its address to the one Jesus called Father, with Jesus who thus made himself the Son, in their common spirit, by which the Church's discourse grasps the resurrection's particular God as the object finally given to it. If theology is as we have so far characterized it, theology is, besides practical and speculative, hermeneutic. Theology is reflection on how to do something, and the thing to be done is to carry on with a specified message, whether as proclamatory word from God or as appeal of petition and praise to God, and whether with the signs of a language or with the gestures and meaningful objects of sacrament and sacrifice. Thinking located at such a place in life, where past hearing turns to new speaking, is what 20th century usage has called hermeneutics. In that the gospel always somehow makes the claim that Jesus is risen, the gospel is a message about an alleged event. That is, the gospel is a piece of news. Even when we speak it to God, it belongs, insofar, to the same general class of utterances as there was an accident this morning on Main Street. Therefore the gospel cannot occur apart from the process of its own tradition. The occurrence of the gospel depends on the chain of witnesses who have brought the news from the first witnesses to those who now hear. The characterization of theology as reflection internal to the attempt to speak gospel must therefore be amplified. We do not in any unmediated way have this gospel that we are to speak, we have it only as we receive it. To state the full case, we must therefore say that theology is reflection internal to the act of tradition, to the turn from hearing something to speaking it. Theology is an act of interpretation. It begins with a received word and issues in a new word essentially related to the old word. Theology's question is always, in that we have heard and seen such and such discourse as gospel, what shall we now say and do that gospel may again be spoken? And now we must question a supposition heretofore made without question. We must ask, why is thinking needed to make this turn? We have heard the gospel and now are to speak it, why not just repeat what we heard? Should not gospel speakers be qualified primarily by accurate memory or close preservation of documents? The gospel, it has seemed in the modern church self-evident to say, lives only in history. If the gospel is indeed to be news decisive for those who, at a time and place, are there to hear it, it must be news about the projected fulfillments and feared damnations by which people's lives are then and there moved, and these are constant across neither time nor space. Thus, to take a self-reflexive example, the very sort of theological questioning in which we are at this point engaged could not occur before the modern experience of historical relativism. But why should we take this view? It is the very purpose of normal religion to defend us from the threats and challenges of our temporality, to anchor us in some mode of adamant persistence. Nor will it finally do simply to adduce the modern West's aversion to absolutes. If we are to assert the historicality of the gospel, of Christianity's particular message, it must be some characteristic of the gospel itself that demands the assertion. We have just encountered this character. The gospel is a promise. The location of the gospel under the rubric of promise goes back at least to St. Paul, but the rubric's fully systematic use is the work of Philip Melanchthon. Point 34. All our discourse with one another, said Melanchthon, can be brought under one of two headings. It is either law or promise. The possibility of accommodating the great variety of human discourse under one or the other of these headings depends on the insight that all actual discourse in some way opens the future. Point 35. Whenever I address you, I somehow pose to you a future that might not otherwise have been yours, whether it is the lifetime opened by I love you or the moment of action or contemplation proposed by the cat is on the mat. Noting this, we may then ask, how does any particular utterance open the future? It was Melanchthon's insight that all our discourse can in this respect be brought under two rubrics. Some utterances open the future in the way of promise, and all others can be taken together as law. Every possible future has its conditions. Point 36. You will, of course, go to college, parents may say to their child, but the arrival of the future thus evoked depends on a vast concatenation of prior events. I lay down the laws when I so evoke possibility as to lay on my hearer some conditions of its fulfillment. You will go to college, if your grades are good enough to get a scholarship. I speak promise when I so evoke possibility as myself to assume these conditions. We will see to the funding. The gospel, by the insight of Melanchthon and his colleagues, is God's promise and nobody's law. It should be noted that law in this sense is not equivalent to the Torah of Israel's Bible. Therefore the gospel is itself an impeller and enabler of history. For, precisely, promises not only open a future to our vision but themselves enable that future. They contain and convey the future possibility. They signify. Point 37. And therefore the gospel must itself have history. This history of the gospel is necessarily a history of thought, in that the gospel is a message and Christianity therefore a missionary community. Christian understanding of God or humanity or destiny always emerges by the reinterpretation of some antecedent religious and theological understanding. People do not first invoke eternity when the gospel mission penetrates their temporal or geographical space. When in a particular cultural religious arena the gospel's carriers arrive to speak of God, or to use other religiously or morally loaded language, their discourse simultaneously depends upon and collides with an antecedent discourse. Point 38. In the complex spiritual and linguistic event of such encounter, the gospel comes to be spoken just as it reinterprets antecedent religious understanding. If the encounter goes well, the reinterpretation will be at once appreciative and polemical. In the history leading to the Christianity of Europe and its theological descendants, the initially encountered antecedent religious and theological interpretation was that provided to ancient Mediterranean culture by Greece's religious thinkers. As we have noted, there was much appreciation in this meeting. There was also conflict. For central example, Mediterranean antiquity defined deity by immunity to time, by impassibility. Offensively to this definition, the gospel identifies its God by temporal events of Exodus and resurrection. The Trinitarian and Christological struggle of the ancient Mediterranean Church, from which resulted most of what is now theologically definitive of Christianity, and to which much of this volume will be devoted, was the working through of this dissonance. Point 39. Since the gospel thus always has and agitates a conflicted conceptual history of its own, the theological question has a temporal seam. Given what we have heard and seen as the gospel, what shall we now say and enact that the gospel may be spoken? It is in the seam between these questions that there must be thinking, that theology is actual as hermeneutic. 6 theological propositions' logical form can now be stipulated. Theology is critical and possibly innovative interpretation at the turn from hearing to speaking the gospel. Thus every theologumenon has the implicit form, to be saying the gospel, let us say F, rather than a G. F may be a sample of right gospel, or it may be a metalinguistic stipulation about the gospel. So, to take random examples, Paul, in the first style, laid it down, to be saying the gospel, say Jesus is Lord, and never Jesus be damned. 40. And Thomas Aquinas, in the second style, determined, to be saying the gospel, let nothing be said that would imply potentiality in God. 41. Statement of theology's logical form allows us to specify the indispensable churchly notions of doctrine and dogma. A recommendation of the form, to be speaking the gospel, say F rather than G, may be addressed by a member or members to the community, or it may be addressed by the community to her members. In the former event, the proponent or proponents function as what is now called a theologian or a theological school. In the latter event, the church exercises her teaching office, her magisterium, saying to her members, if you want to speak for this community, say F rather than a G. Such churchly instruction is called doctrine. Some but not all doctrines are dogmas. The distinction is perhaps most clearly marked by the notion of irreversibility. Point 42. Every theological proposition states a historic choice, to be speaking the gospel, let us henceforward say F rather than that. Other possibility. A dogmatic choice is one by which the church so decisively determines her own future that if the choice is wrongly made, the community determined by that choice is no longer in fact the community of the gospel. Thus no church thereafter exists to reverse the decision. Therefore, to believe that the entity which now calls itself the Christian Church is the Church of the Apostles, and to believe that the Church's past dogmatic decisions were adequate to their purposes, not necessarily in every way appropriate to them, comes to the same thing. If, for example, the decision of Nicaea that Christ is of one being with the Father was false to the gospel was thereby so perverted that there has since been no church extant to undo the error. There are few dogmas, for there have been few occasions on which the Church has found it both necessary and possible to speak to her members in this ultimately committed fashion. Finally, in this section, it follows from all the foregoing that theology is actual as a continuing consultation. Theology is not the adding of proposition to proposition in the steady construction of a planned structure of knowledge. It is a discussion and debate that, as it continues, regularly confronts new questions, and from which participants drop out and into which new participants enter. Thus it makes its own use of all interventions, even when the offered contribution is itself a comprehensive systematic construction like that to be presented here. It is the fate of every theological system to be dismembered and have its fragments bandied about in an ongoing debate. 7. In our description, theology has appeared as what is now often called second-order discourse. The first-order discourse of faith is, on the one hand, proclamation and, on the other hand, prayer and praise. We have described theology as hermeneutic reflection about this believing discourse. Analysis of linguistic kinds and levels is typical of postmodern reflection, and it may have been noted that successive terms of analysis used in this chapter have been adduced roughly in their historical order of dominance. The chief point to be made under this heading follows. From the whole previous content of this chapter, insofar as theology is second-level discourse, it is best described as a sort of grammar. 43 The Church, we may say, is the community that speaks Christianese, and theology formulates the syntax and semantics of this language. Doctrinal statements function as accepted rules of proper usage. Theological opinions of individual theologians or schools are attempts to point out such rules. Materially, the point is of course not new. Councils, popes, and theologians have always intended their pronouncements to determine rules of the Church's discourse. Thus the Chalcedonian dogma that Christ is very God and very man in one hypostasis instructs us to attribute whatever we predicate of God the Logos and whatever we predicate of the man Jesus to one and the same logical subject, and it further instructs us to denote that subject interchangeably by the names and identifying descriptions apt to pick out God the Logos or by the names and identifying descriptions apt to pick out the man Jesus. That is, we are taught that such hymnic and proclamatory sentences as God the Son died, or Jesus rules are properly made sentences of Christianese. The postmodern bent is in explicitly noting that it is in this way that doctrine instructs us, and in exploiting the observation. Theological propositions seem, however, never actually to appear as pure grammatical rules. Thus, Christ is very God and very man in one hypostasis seems to say something not just about language, but also about an extra-linguistic entity, the person Jesus Christ, and the drafters and promulgators of the doctrine would certainly have denied that it could accomplish its grammatical task except just as it has this descriptive force. Theological propositions have in general the appearance of regulating language by stating extra-linguistic fact. Thus they belong to what the logical positivists, the last great modern analysts of language, called the material mode of discourse. 44 Under this rubric, the positivists grouped the many propositions of traditional philosophy and everyday discourse that regulate first-level discourse, and so are themselves at a second level, but do so by apparently stating facts of a peculiar sort, labeled metaphysical, because such facts must themselves be located at a corresponding second level. A classic example of such a proposition is, every event has a cause. The positivists, who took the physical sciences as the paradigm of descriptive legitimacy, regarded alleged metaphysical facts as bogus and so regarded use of the material mode as misleading. They undertook to clarify utterances in the material mode by translating them into pure second-level rules stripped of the appearance of stating fact. With many propositions of philosophy and common discourse, this treatment proved salutary. But Christian doctrine's appearance in the material mode proved resistant to this interpretation, and therefore the positivists labeled them nonsense. The ineradicable materiality of theological propositions appears clearly, for example, on the classical doctrine of Trinity. The doctrine asserts that God in himself is, in fact, not other than he is in his history among and with us, for example, as God appears in the story of Jesus' baptism, in which the Son hears the Father address him and the spirit of this fellowship is manifest, so really, says the doctrine, is God in himself. Therefore, says the doctrine of Trinity, we will speak falsely of God if we speak of him otherwise than as we speak of him in telling this story. 45 It may indeed sometimes be possible to analyze individual theologomena into second-level grammatical rules and distinct first-level sentences of prayer, proclamation, or believing speculation. But the material mode is native to theology in at least the sense that all sentences of Christian doctrine could not simultaneously be stripped of it. Nor therefore does any considerable body of theology ever in practice appear as pure second-level discourse. For insofar as theological propositions are factual propositions, they will be logically and epistemically homogeneous with propositions of first-level proclamation and prayer, as is God is. Love 46 We may make a closely related point by noting that if Christian theology is grammar, then it is prescriptive grammar. Theology does not necessarily map the actual practice of the Christianese speaking community at any time. The magisterium, or indeed an individual theologian or theological party, may sometimes need to instruct even an enduring majority that it is perverting the gospel, that it is speaking Christianese ungrammatically. 47 Secular modernity has supposed that grammar cannot prescribe usage but can only describe it, because secular modernity could acknowledge no one to give the prescriptions. The King's English, if the king only reigns and no longer rules, becomes simply the usage of all those who claim to speak English. Speakers of Christianese need not share this privation, not having lost their king. Every theologumenon lays down a prescription: speak in this way and not in that other way to which we may be inclined. We are able to do this because we do indeed overhear how our King speaks. We are in one community with the discourse of God and his saints. 8. Finally, in this chain of characterizations, since theology is in what the logical positivists called the immaterial mode, it must also be what they derided as metaphysics. That is, it claims to know elements of reality that are not directly available to the empirical sciences or their predecessor modes of cognition, but that yet must be known, if only subliminally, if such lower-level cognitive enterprises are to flourish. We may press theology's claim very bluntly by noting that theology, with whatever sophistication or lack thereof, claims to know the one God of all and so to know the one decisive fact about all things, so that theology must be either a universal and founding discipline or a delusion. 48 Thus, if theology is hermeneutics, it is universal hermeneutics. The act of interpreting with which it is concerned can turn to anything at all. But when hermeneutics become universal, they just so become metaphysics. Much mid-20th century European thinking, both of philosophers and theologians, was very explicitly hermeneutics of this sort. 49 Again, if theology is grammar, the very first work to which the labels metaphysics was attached was Aristotle's attempt to discern a universal grammar. It is a particular, and particularly baneful instance of an error earlier noted that theology, when it has acknowledged its own claim to universal scope, has sometimes nevertheless thought it must achieve this by finding the right metaphysics among those offered by officially designated philosophers. Thus the recent process theology simply took over the metaphysics of Alfred North Whitehead, whereas many epigones of Bultmann simply adopted those of Heidegger. 50 This procedure is sometimes justified by the example of classic theologians such as Thomas, who is said to have adopted Aristotle's metaphysics when it became available. But that is exactly what Thomas did not do. He conversed with Aristotle, and in the conversation was stimulated and helped to his own metaphysical positions, the key items of which could hardly be less Aristotelian. 51 The great example in the 20th century is the Kirchliche Dogmatik of Karl Barth. Barth did not declare independence from the philosophers because philosophy is something so different from theology that it must be kept at arm's length. His reason was exactly the opposite. He refused to depend on the official philosophers because what they offered to do for him he thought he should do for himself, in conversation with them when that seemed likely to help. The Kirchliche Dogmatik is an enormous attempt to interpret all reality by the fact of Christ. Indeed, it can be read as the first truly major system of Western metaphysics since the collapse of Hegelianism. One need not adopt all Barth's characteristic theologoumena to take this massive work as model and challenge in this respect. 9 It is time to distinguish systematic theology from other subdisciplines. The theological question faces in both directions from its temporal seam. Given what we have heard and seen as the gospel, what shall we next say and enact, that the gospel may be spoken? Thus we must ask, wherein was what we heard and saw the gospel? And we must ask, what are we tomorrow to say and enact in order to say and enact this same gospel? If these two-part questions are in significant degree separately pursued, a development peculiar to modern Western theology, historical theology will emerge as a discipline distinct from normative theology. This was the first disciplinary distinction to emerge within theology, and remains the only one of conceptual importance. The distinction of historical from normative theology has been an equivocal blessing. Historical study, including historical study of the Bible, remains theological only as it indeed asks, wherein was past churchly discourse the gospel 7. Pursued as distinct from normative theology, historical theological studies are tempted to forget that this is their defining question. When they fall to this temptation yet remain within the theological curriculum, they, including historical study of the Bible, become superfluous at best. Within normative theology, we may distinguish pastoral and systematic theology. Pastoral theology's questions are posed by the exigencies of the Church's daily task. Systematic theology is so called because it takes up questions posed not only by current urgency but also by perceived inherent connections of the faith. Thus, systematic theology may raise problems that otherwise have not yet emerged in the Church's life and maintain discussions whose immediate ecclesial pastoral challenge is in abeyance. So the Arian controversy, 52, that is, the 4th century collapse of the Church's then established theology, happened when persons who would now be called systematic theologians probed a conceptual incoherence within received normative theology. And the historic challenge this discovery posed was more deeply to comprehend a conceptual structure of the faith. It must quickly be noted that also the internal coherence of the faith does not impose itself by mere analysis, but rather in the historical course of the Church. Thus the conceptual structure that the anti-Arian theologians invoked was discovered in phrases and practices of established liturgy. Therefore even the most systematic theology cannot refrain from exploring history, as will be superabundantly plain in the following. Finally, a distinction is sometimes made between systematic theology and dogmatic theology. This distinction is yet more relative. Theology is the Church's continuing communal effort to think through her mission of speaking the gospel. Dogmas are the irreversible communal decisions made so far in that effort. Therefore all theology is subject to the authority of dogma and may in turn contribute to dogma yet to be formulated. The theologian who understands his or her work knows that to proceed in contradiction or indifference to dogma is to turn from theology to another practice. If dogmatic and systematic theology are to be distinguished, it will be by a relative difference of pedagogical aim. Dogmatic theology is more explicitly concerned to explain the existing dogmas of the Church. Systematic theology is more freely concerned with the truth of the gospel, whether dogmatically defined or not. The present work was named by a process differing little from consultation of the Urim and Thurim.